When any government shall be found inadequate or contrary to these purposes, a majority of the community has an indubitable, inalienable, and indefeasible right to reform, alter, or abolish it in such manner as shall be judged most conducive to the public weal. Section 3, Virginia Declaration of Rights.
George Mason is perhaps one of the most understated figures in U.S. history.
Jefferson called him one of the greatest minds he had ever met, and Patrick Henry called him the greatest statesman and debater that he had ever seen or witnessed.
One of the most important things about Mason was that he actually saw the important and innovative constitutional issues. He was really a more philosophical thinker.
We think about the Declaration of Independence and the beautiful language that was brought into it. We sometimes don't realize that a lot of that language was actually taken and recycled by Thomas Jefferson from some language that George Mason wrote in the Virginia Declaration of Rights.
George Mason actually wrote the blueprints for the three most sacred documents in our history. That is the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence.
What George Mason managed to do in this document was nothing short of remarkable. He was able to incorporate Enlightenment thinking, a lot of the greatest thinking from the Scottish Enlightenment, from John Locke and others, and incorporate it into a cohesive whole that sort of matched up with the English legal tradition and reduced to a couple of pages the argument for the American Revolution.
George Mason was probably one of the most important figures in U.S. history, but unfortunately a lot of people don't know his name. He's kind of been lost to history and has been called the lost founder because he's not as famous as Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or Patrick Henry.
George Mason had a fascinating life in that he was a businessman. He was a family man. He cared first and foremost about tending to those closest to him, his wife and his children.
He had a kind of difficult childhood because when he was 10, his father died, and he was raised partly by a man named Mercer, John Mercer, who had a wonderful library of 1,500 books, which is really quite rare at the time.
And he was basically self-taught by Mercer in the law. Even though he didn't go to law school, he was very intellectual, very curious, and as one historian said, he was the premier constitutionalist in the colonies, not only in Virginia, but of all the colonies. George Mason was called to the convention, the Virginia Convention, to declare independence in May of 1776. He was in Williamsburg with the other Burgesses. Washington was there also. And he actually wrote, he was given a committee's assignment to write a declaration of really rights, independence. And he actually wrote it. It was adopted in June of 1776, almost 3 weeks before Jefferson wrote the famous Declaration of Independence.
He laid out a whole series of the rights that the colonists regarded as their rights as Englishmen, but added things like the freedom of the press and freedom of conscience, which some of the other states, in fact, at that time didn't really have. I mean, to vote in Massachusetts, you had to belong to the official religion.
One of the things that it did was that it helped solidify this idea that human beings have rights and that they are freestanding. They're not conferred by any despot or, for that matter, any government. They just exist by virtue of the fact that we exist.
Once there's the Declaration of Independence and the states are independent, then Congress says now you need to make your own constitutions because you can no longer use the charters, the English charters.
No other state before Virginia had a Bill of Rights, and all the other states, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, followed and basically copied, almost word for word, Mason's Declaration of Rights.
It also ended up having a significant influence on the Constitution itself. Many of the philosophies embraced in that made their way into the Constitution and into elements of the Bill of Rights.
The Declaration of Rights of Mason was the preamble to what became Virginia's Constitution. And he felt very strongly that it should have been the preamble to our Constitution.
He was drawn into the Constitutional Convention, yet again somewhat unwittingly, somewhat against his will.
You have to remember that his wife had died at the age of 39, leaving him with 12 children to raise by himself. So he did not want to leave them, but Washington talked him into coming with him to Philadelphia.
He did it out of a sense of duty to the greater cause. He was an active participant in the Constitutional Convention.
He had something to say on virtually everything. But at the end of the day, he really worried about the amount of power that was getting shifted to this new federal government and these clauses that were sort of vague. So it was unclear how much power that it would inevitably have and how much power was going to take from the states.
And he ended up voting against the Constitution and opposing it aggressively, in part because he feared what would happen with this concentrated power. Perhaps first and foremost, he was concerned about the lack of a Bill of Rights in the Constitution and put forward the message that they shouldn't sign the Constitution and that it shouldn't be ratified until a Bill of Rights could first be developed and agreed upon as part of the constitutional structure.
Madison gets the credit for being the father of the Bill of Rights, and I don't think that's historically accurate. Mason should. It was his Virginia Declaration of Rights that formed the first 10 amendments to our Bill of Rights.
And therefore all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of that the freedom of the press is one of the great bulwarks of liberty, and can never be restrained but by excessive bail ought not to be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments general warrants, whose offense is not particularly described and supported by evidence, are grievous and oppressive, and ought not to be granted. Well-regulated militia, composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free, speedy trial by an impartial jury of 12 men of his vicinage. Virginia Declaration of Rights.
These all fundamental rights, the most important rights in our Bill of Rights, came from George Mason.
And of course, there were those who argued that it didn't need a Bill of Rights because the central government didn't have those powers. And if you attached a Bill of Rights, it would seem like they did. But there were still so many people quite upset that it lacked those basic rights that he was, I think, in some ways maybe justified in not wanting to approve it.
He told Jefferson, basically on his deathbed, that he could have lived with everything, all the compromises at the Constitutional Convention, except for the importation of slaves. And that was when he said, I would sooner chop off my right hand than sign it, because he knew that slavery was a curse and that would become a problem. In fact, he predicted that it would soon lead to a civil war, which it did. When he said that all men are born free, equal, and independent, he meant that they were breaking off from England, and all men had natural rights, inherent rights is what he called them, to be free to make their own choices.
And that was the phrase that upset some of the Southerners who felt that it kind of negated the possession of slaves.
He was setting in motion a couple of significant things. Number one, the Revolution itself, and the idea of throwing off the monarchy and throwing off the very concept of a monarchy, because that put human beings on equal ground, one toward another. Secondly, this embraced the concept that one man should never own another. Human beings are not chattel and should never be treated as such. This is significant George Mason, himself the holder of slaves, put in place the philosophical seeds to destroy the institution of slavery. He really had a sound understanding of government and how governments work, the dangers that they pose, and the inequities that can come about in any society that refuses to recognize the eternal value and the inherent worth of the individual human soul.
So he was really a brilliant innovator and thinker, rather than just trying to figure out how we could, get on with a government that would work. He's sort of looking for the more eternal issues.
Jefferson gets credit for the Declaration of Independence. Madison gets credit for the Bill of Rights. But it was Mason's words, it was his original thoughts that formed the basis for these other people who got the credit for it. And he did not become a public politician like Jefferson, like Madison, like Washington. So he is kind of lost, kind of forgotten as a founder, but he should be remembered as one of the most important figures in American history.
That all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Section 1, Virginia Declaration of Rights.